and welcome to Code to Cloud. And in this episode, we're going to talk about dev containers and GitHub Codespaces. And I'm your host, as always, Kevin Evans. So there's a couple of prerequisites that you need to get up and running with what we're going to be delivering today. Number one, if you're going to be doing local dev containers, then you need to basically have a Docker environment running. So if you're on Windows, WSL, so Windows System for Linux, if you're on Mac OS or Linux, then you've already got the ecosystem. But having Docker enabled locally will help you run these containers, right, and help you develop them. Number two, you need a GitHub account, which everyone should have, hopefully, that's watching the show. If not, get yourself a GitHub account. You also need a GitHub account that's attached to an enterprise organization. If you don't know what that is, have a work with your have a word with your your employer where you work, see if they've got that. But let's just get this started and let's get going. So in order for to do this, I've set up a brand new repository called Azure Terraform, because today the example I'm going to use is deploying infrastructure to Azure. So what are the tools required and what do I need to deploy infrastructure as a code to Azure using Terraform? So if you don't know what a dev container is, imagine it like a virtual workbench where I've got everything that I need to help me basically develop manifests, modules of Terraform and deploy them to Azure. So let's get started. Now, I've already created this repo. I've cloned it locally to my VS Code, but let's just go through it very quickly. So I'm just going to make this full screen. So as we can see here, all I've got is a git ignore file to exclude certain Terraform files and a basic README, which hopefully GitHub Copilot will write for me later. But let's just take a look, right? So some of the extensions I've got installed are dev containers and GitHub Codespaces already, right? So GitHub Codespaces extension helps you through the authentication process and basically lining you up with your GitHub account, right? The dev container one, as you can see here, basically interacts with Docker locally to spin up a local container virtualized locally on my laptop. So let's get started. So let's go back to the file explorer. I'm just going to get rid of this. I'm going to go to view command palette. And what I'm going to say is I'm going to type in dev containers, right? You can already see it there. So there's already a list of commands, right? But the one we're looking for is add dev container and configuration file. So we're going to walk through the process of just using some samples that are already there in the community to build out our dev container. Now you can write these from scratch if you want, but I always find it easier. If someone else has done the hard work, then why don't you try and use it, right? Like that's the power of automation. So let's click on that. So it's going to ask me, right, a couple of options here, right? So where do you want to keep this configuration? So we can add a configuration to the user data folder, or we can add the configuration to a workspace. Now I'm going to go for the workspace because I like to share this with others via source control as a good DevOps Samaritan. So let's click on this. So the next stage is it's looking for an operating system for the image, the container image, sorry. So there's a list here, right, of popular flavors. We've got the Mighty Alpine here, Debian, there's some Kubernetes, but the one we're going to look at today is Ubuntu. Why am I choosing Ubuntu? One, I don't like pain. And two, this is a very common operating system in the Linux and open source world, right, with a lot of support. So it's enough to get me up and running. So I'm going to click on Ubuntu. It's asking me which flavor of Ubuntu. So I say flavor, which version of Ubuntu. Now, if you don't know, Ubuntu has code names for its versions. So I'm going to click on Jammy, right? Just keep it simple. The next stage is features. Now, features are like the dependencies or the packages that are required to help me do my day-to-day job. So if we're going to be deploying to Azure using Terraform, then we need certain packages to help us through the CLI. So the first one I'm going to do is Azure CLI. So type in Azure CLI is at the top of the list. It installs the Azure CLI along with needed dependencies, right? So I'm going to click on that. Now you can see that one's selected, but we're going to add some others. I'm going to type in Terraform. So I've got Terraform. So it's going to install the Terraform binary for me. And then I'm going to install Tofu. So I'm going to look for, I'm going to say, so I've got OpenTofu. Sorry, I was looking for the wrong one. So I'm going to select that as well. And then I'm going to look for AZTF export. Now, if you don't know what this is the Microsoft developed tool for basically exporting your Azure resources into a Terraform configuration file. Really handy. I use this all the time for reverse engineering our Azure services. So imagine you've spun up a new service that you haven't used before. Deploy it via the portal. It's the easiest way. Then go into this tool, use it to create yourself a Terraform configuration file, and it helps you understand what you've done in the portal into HCL, so HashiCorp configuration language. So I'm going to click OK. I've got 4 selected there. So the next step is, do I keep the feature defaults and configure options? Now you can select different versions, or you can use tags like latest, but I'm just going to keep the defaults to keep it out of the box for this demo. And as you can see here in the bottom right, it's starting to build my container. So what we've got here is basically the basic configuration file for getting this Docker container up and running. So I've got a hidden folder called dev.container, which has a file inside of it called devcontainer.json, right? And then I've got some other GitHub depend.bot YAML files in here as well that have been deployed out of the box through that drop-down wizard. But if we just look at the features here, we've got our Azure CLI, we've got our AZ Terraform export, we have Terraform itself, and then we have the open source version of Terraform, which is to OpenTofu, right? So I'm just going to rename this from Ubuntu to Azure Terraform. So, typo. So we've got our features. Now, what I want to try and add is some customizations to this. And you're probably wondering what customizations are. So customizations are, well, imagine a dev container when you spin it up inside your VS Code. So when you connect to it from VS Code, right, to your either local dev container or your Codespaces environment, it would be good if I had the extensions that are required to help me develop for Terraform, right? Be that the HashiCorp Terraform syntax validator, maybe I want Prettifier, maybe I want a spell checker, these kind of things. So underneath this line, we can add a couple of options. So we've got, I'm going to do, we should have it here, customizations. And then we're going to do, if I do another brackets and then click on VS Code, and then if I bring that down, and then we see we've got extensions. So if I go extensions, tab that out, and now I've got some brackets here. So if I copy, and this is me cheating a little bit, but I've done this a few times. But if I copy what I've got on the other screen, paste them in. I'm just going to format this. So I've got some extensions that are going to be installed. They're going to, when this spins up, this dev container, it's going to tell VS Code that you need these extensions to run, right? And that will help you get up and running and developing infrastructure as code as quickly as possible, which is amazing for us infrastructure developers. So I'm just looking here. I've always got a typo, expected comma. So if no, people are screaming at me when I'm doing this. No, let me, if I got all the commas here, just double checking. No, come on. Let me try. Let's get GitHub Copilot. Accept. No, it still didn't work. So hang on, just bear with me. So I'm gonna. It's asking me to put a comma in there. Let me see what this is doing. So I've got customizations. Let me... do you know what it is? I found it. No? Do you know what? I'm just going to cheat. So I'm going to grab this customizations here. And I'm going to paste it in. So still not doing it. What is going on? Right, hang on. So customizations, VS Code, extensions, comma, 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 trailing comma. Is it here though? There we go. Nothing beats doing some troubleshooting and looking for that comma, right? While you're recording a session for YouTube. So I've got some more errors here. Fix those. So now we have our configuration file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to commit this to my repo because we'll need this later for our GitHub Codespaces. So I'm going to call this First Blood. If you're a fan of Rambo, you'll understand that term. So I'm just going to commit that. Click yes. And then I'm going to sync it up. Click OK. So sync the changes to our repo in GitHub. So let's test this container. So I'm going to come down here and there's a open a remote window. And I'm going to reopen this configuration file that we've just built for our dev container locally. So I'm going to click on reopening container. So hopefully, fingers crossed. So this is going to start spinning up. You can see this has brought up Docker for me. It's starting my dev container locally. Keep that up there. Right, so you can see that new container was spun up 12 seconds ago. It's called Wonderful G, and it's VS Code, and it's Azure Terraform as we labeled it, right? So if I see the terminal here, so if I do Terraform, Terraform's installed. If I do OpenTofu, I think I've got that right. Is it called Tofu? Got Tofu installed. So you can see that our dependencies are installed, right? So we're ready to go. You can also see that our extensions have also been installed as well for HashiCorp, which is really good to see. Now, so we've got that like, we've developed it locally. We've tested it out in our local Docker environment, but we want to scale it out to our team, right? We want to be able to share the love. So what we're going to do is we're going to set this up in GitHub Codespaces. Now, there's a couple of ways that we can do this. I've got the extension installed in VS Code, so we can do it via VS Code, but we can also do it through the GitHub repo. So I'm just going to quickly show you where that is. So if I minimize that, bring you back. If I go to code on the repo, so I've got Azure Terraform. This repo is going to be public, so you can use it as reference. If I click on Codespaces, I can do new with options, right? So the branch would be main. I can select the region, which would be US West. I can do the machine type, which would be 2 cores, 8 gig of RAM, and 32 gig of disk, right? It's pretty beefy, right? So imagine you have a scenario where you don't have a super powerful laptop. This is amazing, right? So imagine it's sort of like a mainframe approach. So, or a virtual desktop, a VDI session. So that's one way of creating the code space. But we're going to do it through VS Code. So I'm just going to minimize this. Coming back to my dev container in VS Code. And we are going to click on open again. And we're going to go create new code space. So it's loading my repositories. I'm going to click on Azure Terraform. I'm going to use the default branch of main. And this is going to go and speak to GitHub. I'm going to select the virtual machine that I'm going to use. Now, the virtual machine, you never see it. It's it's basically made available to you, right, as a dev area. So we're going to click on 2 cores, 8 gig of RAM, 32 gig of storage. So now this is going to go away and deploy my dev container in Codespace, in GitHub Codespaces. Now, the benefits of this is if I use GitHub Codespaces rather than a local Docker environment, 1, you don't need powerful hardware then. 2, I can use stuff like my iPad or another tablet, right, to basically code from the beach if I wanted to. This process does take a few minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the video and then we're going to come back and we're going to carry on once it's completed. Right, welcome back. You can see now that our code space has been deployed. It's starting to open up in VS Code. And what we'll see now is that we can see in the bottom left that we've got I love the code names, right, or the automatic generated names for our code spaces. So we've got orange space palm tree, which I really like. So we are now connected to our code space in GitHub. So if I bring up the terminal, so bring up new terminal, bash, we can see here that I'm connected, right? So if I do Terraform, not Terraform, but Terraform, it's installed. If I do Tofu, we're rock and roller, right? It's on. So you can see that our extensions have also been installed as well. So for HashiCorp as well, right? To validate our Terraform code. Now, this is a great way to scale to teams, right? By giving them, like when I started off doing infrastructure as a code, I didn't know what tools I needed. I didn't know what development environment I needed, but now I can basically create a template for this and scale it out to teams, colleagues, and friends. So if I just go back to GitHub as well, if I bring that back up, if I go back to my repo, if I click on Codespaces, you can see that our orange space palm tree has been spun up. So that concludes our demo. I hope you've liked what we've done today. I find using dev containers really useful. Like it just saves me a load of time, right, to getting up to speed. So, if I rebuild my laptop or if I'm working from another device, then I've got, everything I need up and running straight away from my dev containers that I've got and the configuration code stored in GitHub. So if you like what we've done, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Also, don't forget to check out the new community that we've got. So community.codetocloud.io. And yeah, I'll catch you on the next one. Goodbye for now.
Yeah.